Welcome to the next part of our lecture. In our last lectures, we have discussed about the ethics of conservation, and we also have discussed about the divergent approaches of conservation. Now, these ethics or divergent approaches of conservation and the different terminologies what we have used and what should be followed. As I told you that there is no easy answer and there is no universal answer. I mean, it is very case specific, and these that how it should be, what should be followed, what are the steps. This didn't come in one day. It took a long time to come to that stage that what should be the conservation philosophy and what should be done or not, or what are the desirable options. And that also is not a very static process, it is also very dynamic. It has been changing, the concept philosophies have been changing over the years. So, today in this lecture and the next lecture, we discuss about the evolution of the heritage conservation and how this conservation as an international movement came about. It is very important to understand this, because otherwise if we understand this, we also do not know that what are the approaches which are coming and what should be the approach one should follow. Now, so this history of architectural conservation, I am mainly following a book which is a history of architectural conservation by Yoko Leto. He is a very well known expert in the field of urban conservation. For a long time he was associated with ICROM, which is an international training center. So, generally I am following that. It is a very detailed work. I have just gave a brief some of the concepts taken from there, and also I am following another book which is the Conservation Movement, a history of architectural preservation, antiquity to modernity. So, these are the basically two books I am following, and there are other references also. Now, before we discuss further, let us see that what we regard as the International Charter for Conservation and Restoration of Monument and Sites, which is generally known as the Venice Charter, formulated in 1964, what it talks about in the beginning. I am just quote, "Imbued with a message from the past, the historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as living witnesses of their age-old traditions. People are becoming more and more conscious of the unity of human values and regard ancient monuments as a common heritage. The common responsibility to safeguard them for future generations is recognized. It is our duty to hand them on in the full richness of their authenticity." So, this is actually the basic essence of the conservation movement, which was very well written, documented in the Venice Charter in its beginning. We see here the chariot of Hampi temple. There are numerous structures, edifices, monuments and others which are there, which we have inherited from the past, and which how it should go to the future generation, how we should preserve. Venice Charter tries to give the articles, and the purpose of that is very clearly mentioned in these few lines. And when we talk about, as I told you, the movement of conservation movement as we see today is not a static approach, it has been dynamic, and there are major three approaches and what we will discuss. One is the traditional approach to the treatment of historic monuments. Second one is the romantic restoration established in the Italian Renaissance time, and which developed particularly in the 19th century, the conservation movement emphasizing the material authenticity and documentary value of the monuments. We will discuss that a little more in detail. And third one is the modern conservation theory, where we see the Venice Charter based on a critical evaluation of the work of art in its aesthetic, historical and use values, as reflected in the Venice Charter and in the policy of ICROM and ICOMOS. So, these are the major broad themes of the conservation movement what we will discuss, and also we will talk about the context as we are seeing today. This is a timeline that you can see that from 15th century onwards to almost the middle of 19th century, we see there is a traditional approach of conservation. This traditional approach is basically trying to keep the monuments in use. And also we see that from that time onwards and up to the middle of 20th century, there is a rediscovery or discovery of the historicity of the monuments, which almost discontinue in the middle of 20th century. Then we also see another movement, which is the stylistic or historical restoration, which almost is very recently we see that, and the conservation movement, which started in the middle of 19th century and it continued. And then also we see there are certain other things that based on the development of the various scientific technologies and other equipments and tools, we saw the scientific restoration process. There is a great deal of improvement that has been going on, and modern restoration and conservation. And finally, what we see is an approach which is more geared towards the sustainable development or ecological approach. So, this is actually the timeline of conservation, because based on this we see that how the emphasis of the conservation, the purpose and the value has been redefined over the years and over centuries, and there has been a reason behind that. And also there are also in the same period, under the same broad umbrella of a particular type of movement or an approach, there are also subdivisions, and there are always sometimes there were conflict and issues. I will just give you a brief summary of that. Now, let us talk about the traditional approach. The traditional approach, basically it was a desire to continue the efforts of previous generation in a harmonious way. As we see here, the Salisbury Cathedral, which is in England, in the 13th century cathedral, it has been used over the years. So, keep it in use, whatever was required, the historic structures are preserved so long as they continue to have use value. So, that was very important, rather than making it as a memorial or as an edifice to keep or preserve. It was a continuity of use which was given a lot of importance, or because there is no specific reason for destruction. I mean, it continued, it sometimes was a purpose, it was in use, and people went on adding to that, restoring that, and there was not so much of conservatism that what should be the material and other, whatever the traditional techniques were available, that was the major aim and objective, to keep that in use. So, that is what we consider as the traditional approach. Now, in this approach, we see the essence of restoration was oriented towards keeping intact the function of the monument, as what we term as the use value, through renovation and renewal, even by improvement sometimes. So, there was not much of a dogma that this shouldn't be done or that should be done. So, it is basically the function was very important, and through renovation and renewal, even by improvement, which really showed concern for the material substance. So, as and when whatever was required, the repair restoration was going on, and a lot of structures were preserved and were kept in use in that way. So, that is broadly the traditional approach. The basic intervention theories of historic preservation, what we see later on, is the dualism between the retention of the status quo and a restoration that creates something that never actually existent in the place. So, that actually started later on, that when there was a conflict between what should be the approach, and these as we see a lot of structures as we see today, like let us say for Hampi, which was and a picture which shows 1850, which is a great heritage, which is a World Heritage Site now, and we see what is heritage Hampi today. We see that it has been cleaned, it has been repaired, and it is preserved as a historic structure. It is not much has been restored there, it is basically maintaining the status quo. But how it all started is the second approach of the conservation, which is generally under a broad umbrella, is termed as the romantic restoration, and it started mainly during the Renaissance time. The basic approach, the major emphasis of this romantic restoration was learning, to take the lessons from the historic structures and as also a symbol of a social prestige. The historic significance of building was basically to reflect a particular moment or period in history. As we say that it basically started in the Renaissance time, we see some of the gate which is the Roman heritage, and people or the experts or the people who are believed in this type of restoration, they try to capture, restore and preserve and or to learn the lessons from the monuments which generally were built during the Roman and the Greek time, the classical heritage, and to learn lessons from that. So, as we see that they were national monuments, frozen illustrations of a particular moments in the history of a nation. It was very different from the traditional approach, because traditional approach or basic aim was the continuity. It continued to be repaired, restored and in use. Whereas, in the Renaissance time, the Renaissance restoration, it was almost a frozen for a particular period of time. And what happened, because there was a renewed interest in the historic monuments, the antique works of art and structural solution, they also became a model that what should be the architecture of tomorrow. So, that was the value of those structures. Conservation and re-evaluation of the authentic objects. So, authenticity was given a lot of importance in under this type of approach, and preserving his historic stratification and original material. We will see two approaches, that the stratification, that how it has changed over the years, was also taken into consideration, and also the original material, which was not so much there in the traditional approach, was given a lot of importance in during this time under this romantic restoration approach. And avoiding falsification, there was no place for falsification, the authenticity was given a lot of importance. As I told you, the Arch of Titus in Rome, as we see that because it was there in ruins, and there was a renewed interest to learn from them, and they were a status of a nation or a national history of the ancient ruins and what was the classical civilization, classical architecture. A lot of methods developed to document them, to actually what is there, document them, the proportion, the material, the details and other things. So, as we see that a lot of people are actually started drawing and keeping an exact documentation of these historical structures. These are the some of the paintings that time that which were done very, very painstakingly, very correctly, that how they were to be documented, all the details were there. And so, conservation and evaluation of the authentic object was given a lot of importance. As I told you, basically in this approach, the national heritage, the nostalgia, the history and art, they were very predominant when we talk about the value and significance of these structures. Example, in this we see the Fountains Abbey, Yorkshire in York. It was a monastic establishment which was in ruins, no longer in use, but it was kept as a nostalgia and historicity for a particular period. So, there is no necessary to rebuild the roofs over there, they were frozen in time, and whatever was required to keep it and preserve it was done. So, this is the what we say that the heritage in Romanticism. But even within this broad umbrella of the romantic restoration process, there were some sort of a conflict and sort of basic approaches differed. Broadly, we see the three types or three types of approaches fall under this romantic historicism. One was which originated in France under Valet-Leduc, which is called stylistic restoration. There the emphasis was more on the form and the design. The other approach in under this romantic heritage restoration was by John Ruskin, which actually formally started the conservation movement as we see today. There the emphasis was more on material and the subjects, not so much on the form and the design. The third approach which happened in Italy, which is more the emphasis was on scientific restoration process. So, emphasis was on evidence and methodology. So, even in this romantic historicism or romantic restoration process, going back to the classical period was important, but within that also there was some sort of a variation in the approaches in these countries under these different gurus what they sought. Let us see one by one that what is the subtle differences between these approaches. Violet-le-Duc, he was basically a French architect, a theorist, a major Gothic revival architect, famous for interpretive restorations of medieval building. We must understand what is this interpretive restoration and what it means and what he tried to depict through his famous restoration projects. So, what he says is to restore a building is not to preserve it, to repair or to rebuild it, but it is to reinstate it in a condition of completeness which may never have existed at given time. So, there lies some sort of that what it means by this reinterpreted which may never have existed. What does it mean? He is well known for restoration of a lot of projects. Most famous of this is the Notre Dame in Paris. So, while he was working for the government as a restorer, he was given this prestigious projects. What he did is that he did an analysis which is called inductive analysis and interpretive restoration. While doing this Notre Dame Paris and properly documented, the documentation was very necessary and understanding. Some of the 18th century or the later additions were removed, whereas a particular period additions 12th century and other, they were kept, and sometimes new structures or new portions, new sort of elements were reconstructed to sort of complete that what it should be according to the restorer. So, his interpretation is very important in this case. So, basically as we say that it is to make a complete picture of the place, not incomplete picture. How to make the complete picture of the place based on a very authentic documentation and understanding and analysis. Another example which Violet-le-Duc did is the fortified city of Carcassonne in France. This is a city which has two layers of rampart. It was completely in ruins after the French Revolution, and he was given the task of restoring it. So, while restoring it, he had to interpret a lot and he had to take a decision, and there are certain things which really there was a lot of confusion, lot of conflict and issues regarding the method what he followed for this reconstruction. For example, that when he was building those towers on the roofs of the towers, he used the conical tiles on the hips of the roofs, and that was his interpretation that this completes the picture and this what should have been there. What should have been there is not what was there, and that actually raised a conflict, and later on now they were replaced sometimes with the flat types, which was recorded as the more authentic material. So, this is what is emphasis of romantic restoration, to complete the picture of fort which was in a completely ruinous state, to place the materials, elements or components which according to him completes the picture, and there lies some sort of an issues or conflict. To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to re-establish it in a finished state, which may in fact never have existed at any given moment. I have already talked about that what restoration meant for him. As I told you that there is some sort of a conflicting issue between his approach to restoration and John Ruskin, belonged to England, his approach of conservation. So, dualism is the retention of the status quo, which is the Ruskinian approach, vis-a-vis a restoration that creates something that never actually existed in the place. That is the Violet-Leduc's approach. Ruskin, so we see the comparison between the two. Duck basically talks about an architectural site or monument is an important because it is an evidential value as an archaeological and historical source, whereas Ruskin talks about an aged architecture as a living relic, a continuity. To restore was to destroy. So, he is not talking about restore in that sense, the restore was to destroy, and that the only true course was preservation and conservation. So, as we see that there is a difference between the restoration as Duck talks about, or the French approach to conservation, and Ruskin's approach, which is the British approach of conservation. And while Duck actually talks about restoring it to complete the picture, Ruskin more talks about to keeping it as it is and also the stratification, but both under the broad umbrella of a romantic restoration process. Ruskin was in that sense was basically anti-restoration. His books are very famous, The Seven Lamps of Architecture, which is about the Venice, also the Stones of Venice are there, and he talks about that what should be the restoration process. A lot of sketches, documentations are there, and he through this process Ruskin was actually searching for a meaningful architecture that is strongly rooted in the past. And remember, that was the time where industrial revolution has already happened and a lot of demolition was taking place, a lot of destruction was happening, and in that process we lost a lot of classical architecture. And these are the times where these two historians or the restoration gurus, they came and they talked about that how we should preserve our history. Ruskin firmly refused any kind of material restoration on damaged building, whereas Violet-Leduc basically talk about the Gothic principles. He tried to understand the principle that what these buildings sort of had embedded in that. Ruskin talk about basically searching the meaning in this architecture. Restoration processes in his case was mainly based on the work of illustration and writings on a process of recording the ruins. So, recording the ruins were kept as ring, not as a completing the picture, not on rebuilding their materiality. This is a basic difference in the approach between the French or Violet-Leduc's approach of restoration and Ruskin's approach, but both are under this romanticism or looking back to the history as a part of the romantic architecture. Based on Ruskin's approach, we saw establishment under his disciple William Morris, we saw the foundation of the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB. SPAB, which was established in 1877, it was actually laid the foundation of what we later came to be seen as the modern or very documented formalized conservation movement. Now, this SPAB under Ruskinian approach or William Morris, it talks about to put protection in the place of restoration. So, it is anti-restoration, to stave off decay by daily care, to prop a perilous wall or mend a leaky roof by such means as are obviously meant for support or covering, and show no pretense of other art, and otherwise to resist all tampering with either the fabric or ornament of the building as is done. So, they are talking basically about the maintenance, keeping it as it is, repair, continuous repair and other, but not sort of pretense of some other art, and they are strongly against the tampering with the fabric or the ornament of the building as it stands. Under these approach on the SPAB, a lot of structures, manor houses and others were restored, maintained, not restored, they are maintained, preserved and kept in use. SPAB actually is opposing the destructive restoration of ancient buildings then occurring in Victorian England. As I told you that after the Industrial Revolution a lot of destruction happened or they were restored, which according to SPAB, William Morris and Ruskin was destructive. This is Kelmscott Manor, which according to the authentic painting old sketches they were restored or maintained. Returning functioning buildings to an idealized state from the distant past, which often involve the removal of elements added in their later development. So, the SPB was against this type of removal of elements like what we saw in Notre Dame, Paris and others. So, they were completely against that and they tried to see these as a stratification, all the layers of history preserved in a structure. So, SPAB talks about a practical and sympathetic approach to repair and maintenance of buildings. So, the minimum intervention, campaigning to protect historic building at risk. So, which are the buildings at risk? They try to campaign and they try to say that how they can be kept in use by the minimal intervention process, just maintenance and repair. Based on that, towards around by 1964 there was an Athens Charter in 1930s and after that there was a Venice Charter, which actually had all the people who are involved in conservation, historians, archaeologists, engineers, architects, people from all over the world came and they tried to take a resolution and that how conservation or how to take care of the ancient structures which are important and now they should be passed on to the future generation. And this came to be known as the Venice Charter. The complete name is the Venice Charter is a short form. It is known as the International Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites. And these Second International Congress of Architects and Technicians, they formed certain articles. Very few articles, they are not rules, they are not acts, but they actually give the essence. Even now today they give the essence, almost sort of a guidelines that how we should take care of our future generation. These articles we will take up later on, but in the history we see that Venice Charter in 1964, it was an important landmark in the history of the conservation movement and started the modern conservation movement. So, again I have repeated, I have mentioned that already, imbued with a message from the past, the historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as a living witnesses. This is very important, living witnesses of their age old tradition. We see the genesis was there in SPAB manifesto. People are becoming more and more conscious of the unity of human values and regard ancient monument as a common heritage. So, this concept of not only a national heritage, but a common heritage, the international recognition was a very important part of the Venice Charter. The common responsibility to safeguard them for future generation is recognized. So, it was talking about everybody's responsibility, the responsibility of all the nations, because they are very important to mankind. It is our duty to hand them on in the full richness of their authenticity. So, we try to see, we saw that these terms of authenticity and integrity came about, that what it means, that how we should take care of our ancient structures and monuments and everyday structures. So, with this we come to the genesis of the modern movement of the conservation, which is known as the Venice Charter, where people from all over the world, many nations took part, and we saw the establishment of a common charter that should be applicable and should give a guideline, should give a pathway that how we should take care of heritage that we have inherited from the past. In the next section, we will talk about that how again this Venice Charter change and we that trying to cope up with the changing scenario of the today's world. Thank you.